Hello, I am Joel McLeod.
And I'm Roland Tanner.
And welcome to the 905er. This is our 25th episode. It's quite the milestone for us personally, as we didn't even know if we'd make it to this point. When we started this venture, we sat down with the idea that our communities were more than just an extension of Toronto. The 905 region had grown into its own unique part of Ontario, and with that, Canada as a whole. Yet our media hadn't reflected that point. In fact, our media over time has become more and more concentrated in the hands of a few corporations. Independent media, like the 905er, is the future of news in this province. We have been able to focus on stories that matter the most to you. Stories like the 5,000-strong Black Lives Matter march in Burlington, Hamilton City Council's mistreatment of Cameron Crutch, the ongoing dispute at 1492 Landback Lane in Caledonia, COVID-19 miscommunications from the province is reneging on allowing municipalities to choose ranked ballots for their elections, the division of families in long-term care homes and group homes due to COVID-19 policies, the need for a universal basic income, and the innovation COVID-19 has forced small businesses and industries in the region to adopt to survive. We've covered all these stories and more so far, and there are so many more that we want to keep sharing with you. But we need money to do so. We have ambitions to grow this podcast into a meaningful and impactful news company for the region. But that requires capital to do so, and that is where you come in. Roland and I are asking for you to contribute only $5 per month to our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes, or you can just go to patreon.com/the905er. We encourage you to please contribute today so that we can keep bringing you the stories that matter most to the 905 region. Okay, and on that note, what's on tap for today, Roland?
Well, I think we'll start off by just sort of referring back to our Tuesday episode and what we learned from Hassan and Janet about the province really attacking in some ways, one of the last bastions of independent local authority that has real power over the development industry. And I, for myself, I have no doubt that that's the motivation for why they're making these changes. It's nothing to do with conservation or conservation authorities. It's all about getting what they call red tape, but the rest of us call health and safety legislation out of the way of the development industry. And I guess the element that also came out of that, which ties into a whole lot of other things we've discussed in recent weeks, is the use of omnibus bills as a way to get really important legislation passed without anybody really noticing, or certainly as an attempt in that regard, I think.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's a shame that this is happening, because in this bill 229 that has the Conservation Authority power stripping legislation in it, there's also two other points or a piece of legislation that affect other stories that we've talked about in the past on this podcast. One is in the Bill 229, there is legislation that helps protect the owners and operators of long-term care homes from possible legislation due to malfeasance or neglect or just any matters that may arise to COVID-19 issues for their residents, and allowing families to gain some kind of restitution for that. And the other is the ranked ballot question that we addressed with Dave Meslin and Jesse Helmer and Mary Ann Mead Ward a few weeks ago. I don't see how these help the COVID-19 recovery or aid package in any shape, way, or form. And just to tack these onto that is disingenuous and cheating.
Yeah, to be non-partisan for a second, I'd say that the PCs aren't the only party to have used omnibus bills to get a whole load of business done. However, I think they have certainly made it somewhat of an art form. Mentioning Dave Meslin, in his book, he specifically talks about omnibus bills and how Stephen Harper used those in a way that had never been seen before. So when we talk about omnibus bills, it's usually the budget. Budget bills are confidence legislation, so it means it either passes or the government falls. Putting something into the budget is knowingly raising the stakes. An opposition party has to consider the implications of whether they can bring down the government. Or in the case of a majority government like we have in Ontario right now, the budget bill is going to pass. Just end of story, really. Anything they put in there is going to get through pretty much on the nod.
Well, but the thing that comes down to it is that if these were all separate pieces of legislation that was being tabled in the in the provincial legislature, because the Tories have a majority, they will pass. Like, let's not kid ourselves. They'll be pushed through, whipped through the vote, and they will pass. What the difference, though, is each piece of legislation will be able to be scrutinized by both the NDP, the Liberals, and the Green parties in the legislature, as well. The public might get a little bit more attention to them. You might be able to start prying into what the ramifications of these pieces of legislation are. When they're tied into an omnibus bill, especially one titled the COVID-19 Aid and Recovery Act, people understand when you say, well, no, I need that COVID-19 assistance. Like, we need a plan of attack to address the pandemic, and understandably so. And I get people say that's the immediate priority. And that's kind of the duplicitous nature of this omnibus bill, is that you're basically tying it to people's livelihoods and sneaking it through so that people say, well, you know what, fine, I don't care about Conservation Halton's cripes with it. I need some kind of money to keep my job in place or to keep my business afloat. Yeah, it's very shameful in my opinion.
Well, I think it's something that we need to be aware of, and we should be. Again, this is the kind of thing that the governments assume no one pays attention to. So if the media can pick up on this stuff and highlight it, it makes it much more difficult to get away with. Now, I don't think we're quite at the stage yet where we're able to shame politicians into changing their behaviour, but
well, who knows?
Perhaps one day soon,
Well, but what struck me is in our conversation with Hassan and Janet was Hassan's point that Conservation Halton, and I'm going to extrapolate and assume that this goes for the majority of other conservation authorities in the province, that they're not roadblocks to development. And I do think that's what's being pitched here, is that these are, bureaucratic, power-hungry entities unaccountable to you and I, the taxpayer, and the Tories are finally putting an end to this rampant corruption. And that's not the case. Hassan's point of that they rarely block development, but rather they just point out that, yeah, you're building on a floodplain. The area that you want to develop is highly susceptible to floods. You could be facing huge costs down the road. Why don't you build here instead? In fact, it's one of those things, like, if I was a developer, why wouldn't I be going to the Conservation Halton to begin with and say, hey, where's a good spot to build my next project? Just so that you can, when you go to the public, say, no, we've got it. We're covered. It's ecologically sound. It's a safe investment. We can build. We can make it work. And I find that counter story to be very enlightening.
Yeah, and if you're not going to have something like a conservation authority stepping in with those kinds of powers, then you should, at the very least, make the builders liable for what they're creating. I know before I came to Canada, in the UK, building on floodplains was something that went on for decades on end. With climate change and even more rain happening in Britain than traditionally happens, flooding became a huge problem, with houses basically becoming uninsurable because they were flooded repeatedly year after year after year. And from a developer's point of view, what does a floodplain offer? Well, it's nice and flat. Floodplains are flat. You don't have to build up the side of a hill or anything like that. But they're really, particularly in an era of climate change where the weather is changing and becoming more extreme, they're really no-go areas. So it's much better to have a regulatory authority that says up front, this is a bad idea, you shouldn't be building here, than to let people move into a house, find themselves flooded out 5 times in 5 years, end up with a house that they can't even sell because it can't be insured.
When you say I'm selling my house because it floods regularly,
yeah,
who's going to buy that?
Yeah, I actually had a good friend who had exactly that problem, and this was back in it would have been sort of late 90s. Basically, the house that was just flooded and flooded, and was looking at, well, every time this happens, it becomes less sellable. At the same time as it becomes less of a place I want to live in. And I think Hassan mentioned that other provinces have the same problem that I have experienced of in the UK. And I think he mentioned Quebec in particular. So Ontario's done the right thing in having these conservation authorities with reasonable but relatively strong power. So I think I mentioned that the stable top of bank issue just happens to be one I'm familiar with. Those decisions, those rules, were very much not up for negotiation. So the developers would they know that they couldn't build within distance X of the top of Bank next to Lake Ontario. Therefore, they didn't even try to. If you now make that a matter of negotiation, well, of course, they're going to try to build on any piece of land that they can access.
I mean, it comes down to the Tory speaking point to this is, it provides more accountability to you and I, the taxpayer, except you and I don't have time to go and critique every building proposal brought forward in our backyards. There is a pandemic going on. We all have other priorities. You either have kids in school or you have your own business that you're trying to operate, and you're trying to figure out how do I make that get a success and whatnot. And yeah, you don't have time to sit down and say, at the initial planning phase, when a developer brings forward a plan to city council for approval, yes, I'm going to take the time out of my very hectic and busy life to go down and organize with other strangers that I've never met and have nothing in common with other than this one issue. And I'm going to divert all my resources and energy into why they should not be building there because it's a floodplain. It's a ridiculous proposal. I mean, it sounds good. Accountability. But let's be honest here. Like, the idea is that they know developers won't get a strong opposition. People just won't have time to do it. People won't have time to organize and really drum up the support. People will know, yeah, you shouldn't be building there, but I got other things on my plate right now that I have to focus on. And that's why we have these conservation authorities. So we don't have to sit there and fight with developers every proposal that's brought forward to city council and every year. That's why they're there.
And as it works right now, development is a matter of whoever has the deepest pockets. And the people with the deepest pockets are the developers. This isn't an anti-developer statement. We need housing in this province.
Absolutely.
The population is growing. We need to put people in decent housing, we need affordable housing, we need all these things. And we're not communists. We don't think it should be built by, a workers' collective necessarily.
Yes. But you and I have had this discussion many times offline about we're in the 21st century. COVID-19 has shown that a lot of our urban planning leaves a lot to be desired. Let's say that. And there's a lot of talk of, let's start using our imagination to come up with really good alternatives. I think you and I both said that what we need is to bring a lot of more people to the table. It shouldn't just be city council versus developers. It should be neighborhood groups. It should be conservation authorities. It should be the land developers, the construction companies, the city council, and all these people brought to the table and say, well, what do we want our cities and our communities and our land to look like? And it can't just be a matter of, I got to build a new housing development. I got to build a new condo tower. Yes, we need places to live, but how do we make it livable? How do we make it a place that people say, yes, I want to live here, not just, I got it because I got to put my stuff somewhere.
It seems to me that the issue of development and the amount of angst and unhappiness that often causes, it exemplifies the problems we have, not just in Ontario, but across the Western world, really, with how our democracies work in what I think should be viewed as an old-fashioned and due for update kind of way. That it's still very top down. That the promises justifying these things in omnibus bills by saying, we held a consultation. What consultation? With who? For how long? You're basically talking about a handful of people. Consultations are rarely very good, and under this government, they are laughably small, because this isn't a government that is really interested at all in hearing anybody's opinion, unless it confirms what they already think. And again, that's not necessarily a partisan issue. Many parties have suffered from that. I just think this one has that disease particularly badly. This idea of that we should all have a say in shaping our communities because the people who live here will do the best job of it. The regulations and the legislative framework that we have right in now is very good at building perfectly functional but not very interesting cities. Could Mississauga have been a better city than it is? I mean, millions of, I don't know, can't remember the population of Mississauga, but a lot of people live there very happily and go about their lives. So it's a successful city. But could it have been better if we'd had different development rules in place, if we'd had better ways of consultation? Could we have avoided the mistakes of designing a huge city that depends on cars? That's going to be really difficult to sort of reverse engineer. And the answer to all those things is yes. And I'm not having a go at Mississauga. This is a 905 problem like no other, that we have made really big mistakes in the designs of our cities that we could have avoided if we'd had a little bit of imagination. And maybe we can do it now, but it's not getting any easier when we see legislative changes like these happening.
But we're seeing spin-off effects of just this kind of myopic view of development in the region. And we see it, it's not a direct cause, but I think it is a tangential cause of another story that we covered, which was 1492 Landback Lane in Caledonia. Am I blaming developers? Kind of. There's a developer who decided to build a housing structure right next door to where a previous dispute happened, and you wonder, geez, do you think another dispute might happen? I question their logic on that one. But the idea of we need to build housing development, and we have to go beyond, the Greenbelt. We can't restructure our existing communities to be more habitable, more people-friendly, and that kind of thing. It's just, the only thing we can do is just keep building houses out. Well, that's when we run into issues like 1492 Landback Lane. Is we just need to keep building out. Okay, but that land belongs to somebody else. The need for development can't override the fact that it's land that belongs to somebody else, and you need their permission to build on it. That's kind of the status quo in the province. That's where you and I have been talking, is just we need to rethink how our communities exist and what we want them to turn into, not just, we just keep building more strip malls and more condo towers and more neighborhoods because that's all we know how to do.
It's actually a process that was brought to my attention by a fairly prominent politician whose name I won't mention, and that is the issue of development kind of jumping over the Greenbelt. Around Hamilton, particularly around Burlington, we've designed legislation quite rightly to try and discourage sprawl. So what's happening is rather than trying to build anywhere near the Greenbelt with the difficulties that has, the developers are kind of jumping over it and going, that's the next place we can build instead, which doesn't have these rules. Well, Caledonia, it's right next to the Greenbelt on the other side. And what was a fairly rural place is now seen as, if you want to build cheaply and quickly with a minimum of fuss, kind of ironic in Caledonia's case, but basically, if you want to have the advantages that the old type of endless sprawl development had, that's where you need to go now. And I think that's an issue that needs more attention, because as far as I'm aware, it's not something that's really been picked up by anybody. One of the possible tragedies of the Caledonia situation is that the previous provincial government, I believe in just about the last few months that it was in office, were considering expanding the Greenbelt quite dramatically, specifically to address flooding. It was all about protecting lands which would have an effect on flooding. Obviously, the government fell, but that would very likely have included the lands around Caledonia that are now at dispute, and that would have kind of solved two problems with one piece of legislation. But that's not going to happen under this government. It's very difficult to see any way in which they will ever take a position that doesn't favour developers, and that's just wrong. And then that comes back again to how the parties are funded. Because under the previous, again, I'm really trying not to say, the previous government was wonderful and this one's terrible. They all have their faults. None of them are perfect. Let's just be completely clear about that. However, there was pressure brought by the Toronto Star under the previous government to do away with corporate donations. And they did. One of the reasons in which that government probably fell, because they were finding it much harder to raise money than they did in the past. And the PCs didn't have that problem. One of the first things they did when they came back in was to adjust the interpretation of. They didn't change the legislation, they just changed the interpretation of the legislation to let corporate donations back into the picture, to let ministers attend meetings where potential donors are present. And I would say, there's no doubt whatsoever that PCs, in terms of where their donations come from, is overwhelmingly from things like developers, Matamy Homes, the people behind Ontario Proud.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're getting into a whole other thicket of the weeds there. We know what happened with Ontario Proud in the last election, how they got a huge influx of money from developers to help support their endeavors to, let's face it, install a progressive conservative government. They were very much anti-Kathleen Wynne and wanted to see the Liberals turfed out of government, and they got what they wanted. And everybody wants to get all upset about, but Mattamy Homes and the developers pay for that. And that's true. They did. However, the Liberals and the NDP are equally guilty of getting external parties to donate to a third-party venture. Like there are other entities, unions and whatnot, that would donate to, Working Families for Ontario and that kind of thing, and they would produce ads claiming that the Tories were bad. So that's kind of where we are in this province, is that you get your deep pocket entities to contribute to a third-party campaign of some form or another, and you see who comes out on top. Right now, that's the way it goes. I don't see how that's going to change in the next election. I expect you'll see some other third-party group form, COVID-19 survivors or whatever, something of that nature. And you'll see the teachers' unions, you'll see the nursing unions, the doctors' groups and whatnot contributing to those parties as well to overthrow Doug Ford. Doug Ford will get the developers and his interest to contribute to Ontario Proud or some other third-party venture, and they'll have it out in the media. That's how the game is played today in Ontario politics. Until somebody drastically changes the rules and just finds a way to outlaw this stuff, that's how the game is played.
Yeah, it's ironic that another thing that the PCs immediately abolished when they came in was this happened federally as well. That there was a kind of phasing in, phasing out period that happened when the legislation changed with regard to corporate donations and things like that, whereby the parties were in effect given a subsidy to make up for the fact that they'd lost donations for other places. And the Conservatives, of course, said, well, that's terrible, we shouldn't be subsidising parties. The hypocrisy of that is that every donation that's given to a political party is subsidised up to about 3/4 because you get a tax credit. That's a subsidy. It has been for years. Conservatives are not getting rid of that because basically if you don't have that tax credit, you ain't getting donations. And the donations from individual citizens like you and me, generally, you're very lucky to get more than $50, $100 from a very generous donor, as compared with the $1,200 you can get from corporate places. I mean, the whole system is so flawed from top to bottom, basically because very few people are willing to give money to a political party anymore. If you're going to give, the majority of people will give to, the local animal shelter or cancer charity or an environmental group or whatever. What is the benefit of giving to a political party in the political world that we live in today?
Well, the idea...
As someone who's given a lot to political parties over the years, I have to say that the benefits are pretty small.
Well, you and I know each other from our heyday working locally, politically, paying the political dues and whatnot. Just to be clear to everyone listening, I still am paying dues, but I don't go to any political events at all. I haven't paid any fundraisers in years. But that being said, I mean, I get all the fundraising emails and whatnot still. But the structure is still very much geared towards, we just want your money, give us the money, thank you very much, sit down, don't make a fuss. And I don't know, that's the way it's always been. I can't think of a different time when, because here's the thing. You get the funder, you get the donors. Each party will go after the Mattamy Home CEOs or the Mattamy Home executive that lives in their riding or lives close to their riding. They'll go and talk to them to say, "Hey, come out to my fundraiser, my $1,500, $1,200, whatever the maximum amount is these days. Come out to that fundraiser because I want that." And I guarantee you, if that person calls the Consett office or the office in Toronto, Queen's Park, that member, if they're elected, is going to be rushing back to call them back. Because that check, the idea that I can ask for that check at some point in the next electoral cycle or next year is so much more important than, mom and pop having a concern about transit. Let's say, if you had an issue about transit and you wanted to talk to your local MPP about provincial funding to your municipality, they'll sit down, they'll listen to you. But the person that they're going to really make a point to call back and have a half an hour discussion with is going to be the person who donates $1,500 or $1,250, whatever the maximum is. to their fundraiser. That's just the way it is.
As we're saying, that's all completely legal and fair within the system. And it's just human nature that you pay attention to the person who's writing the biggest check. It's not right. It's corrosive to the ways our democracy works, but it's very difficult to take it out because, I mean, like even so, 2018, when I ran in Burlington, all the donations are a matter of public record. There were no corporate donations in that election to anybody, but some candidates were willing to accept donations from people who happen to be well-known developers. They're personal donations out of their own pockets and the pockets often of their family members, but they're not corporate, right? Yeah, of course they're not corporate, Again, I'm not accusing anybody of doing anything illegal or unfair or wrong. They were completely playing by the rules. But it's very, very difficult to take, it's actually kind of impossible to take corporate money out of the system, short of taking all money out of the system and saying, we're just going to subsidize you guys 100% based on like the number of votes you got at the previous election or something like that, which is an option that is used in some places. I don't know if that's good or bad. Or
that system, to bring it back 180 degrees, Roland, the issue that we have with the omnibus bill is, I think, is tied to that principle. Is that I brought it up in our discussion with Hassan and Janet about the Greenbelt, because if everybody remembers, during the election, a lifetime ago it seems, Doug Ford was caught in literally a back room with developers talking about how he was going to tear up the Greenbelt for them and allow them to start developing into the Greenbelt. We all saw it. We saw the video, and Ontario as a whole said, no. We want the Greenbelt. It is a good thing. Don't touch it. Get your hands off it. And Doug said, I hear the will of the people, and I obey the will of the people. The Greenbelt is off the table. And we all said, okay. We took him as face value. Within the first year, if I recall, Doug Ford then does this the government does this backhanded approach of, we'll allow the municipalities to make the decision if they want to. They thought, okay, that way the municipalities will start carving up and it takes the responsibility off of us. Only problem is, all the municipalities said, no, we want the Greenbelt. I remember Marianne Mead Ward came out immediately, I think that day or the day after, said, nope, the Burlington section of the Greenbelt, we are not touching. It is going to stay intact as it is. And so, that plan didn't work. So what is he doing? They're bringing in the Municipal Zoning Act to tear up in the Pickering, the wetlands in the Pickering. They're changing the Conservation Authority to curb their ability to fight this. And it's clear this government wants to allow developers to build in the Greenbelt. Why? That's who's writing their $1,250 checks.
And I'll point out another catch on that initial piece of legislation, which I believe was introduced in the fall of 2018. Every city that has the Greenbelt in it said, we're not going to use this power. Fine. Doesn't matter, because that power is now appealable to the local planning appeals tribunal. So that means that the city can say, no, we're not going to let you build on our Greenbelt. But the developer can say, well, sure, okay, I'll appeal it to LPAT and see what they say. Now, maybe the LPAT will say, no way. But something that was previously just non-negotiable is now negotiable again. And that's really what the LPAT is all about. It's taking things, it makes everything appealable and negotiable.
When it's negotiable over time, you'll get a win. If you throw darts enough times at the wall, eventually one will stick. That's what they're counting on with these changes, is that, you might lose a couple and the people might win, but over time, without changes to eliminate this catch, eventually one or two will slip through. And that's what they're counting on. And then the precedence takes hold, and it's easier to slip more and more to carve up the Greenbelt.
And what we're seeing in Burlington right now is that much as it was a council elected on a promise of controlling development, the practicalities of the matter, and this isn't a criticism of the council, practicalities of the matter are that once you get to LPAT, you have to do a deal. You have to compromise. You can't go in there and say, no, our way or the highway. The people who chair that tribunal are kind of looking for you to sort it out as quickly as possible and then get out of their hair. So that means if a developer appeals over a piece of Greenbelt land, the city is going to say, well, we can spend a few million defending this and hiring expensive lawyers to try and go to the wall on this thing. Or we can say, well, you know what, you can, rather than 100 houses, you can build 50. Or rather than 100, you can build 80. Reduce the density a bit, reduce the, in downtown places, reduce the height by a couple of floors. It's a negotiation. The developer has got their way at that point. It's a broken system from top to bottom. It doesn't work for anybody. It doesn't work for developers either, I don't think. The only people who come out of this well are the lawyers, because they're getting paid.
Well, you know what? Let's leave it at that for this week, because as the mantra of this podcast, we could be going on for hours on this topic, and we'll come right back to where we are now. So I'm going to pull the plug on this week's episode there, and hopefully you'll hear from us next week. Thanks very much, everyone. That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns, or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
Looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.